Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jaclyn, and I am the head of North America for Dual. Dual is a brand advocacy platform, and as a team, we specialize in allowing brands to tap into their brand networks to build programs for advocates and ambassadors at scale. We really specialize in this topic of brand advocacy, brand communities, and brand ambassadors. We love it. It's our passion. So we're really excited to be joined by, I'm really excited to be joined by Alex today. And Alex, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm head of growth here at Jewel. So working on kind of all things marketing related and really trying to generate demand for what it is that we're all doing here every day. Previously spent a few years at startups and scaling them. So really quite conscious of the situation we find ourselves in today when it comes to how to acquire customers. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, hopefully sharing some light at the end of the tunnel.
Definitely. Okay, can't wait. So, as a bit of context and housekeeping, this is part of a three-part series that we've been running. This is part two. The first part was 2 weeks ago. And in part one, we uncovered essentially and answered the question of what is brand advocacy. So, we looked at why is brand advocacy important, how the best brands have grown through brand advocacy, and then how to engineer advocacy amongst your different networks within a brand. If you missed it and you'd like a recording of it, we do have one. So just feel free to pop me a private message with your email and I can definitely get you that. We are recording this as well, which we will send out after. And then the third part of this series is in 2 weeks' time, on 2 weeks' time. Yeah. And we'll get the exact date. And that will be led by our head of commercial, Ollie, and he'll be chatting through the economics of brand advocacy. So we've got 45 minutes today. Next week, I thought so, June 15th. Sorry. The third part is on June 15th, which is next week. And yeah, so excited to kick into part two of the series. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, it is Zoom, it's a Zoom webinar. So, you guys can see us the whole time. I will man the chat. So definitely feel free. We do want to make this interactive. Definitely feel free to ask questions as we go. I'll make sure that Alex sees them. We will leave a bit of space for Q&A at the end as well. So definitely feel free to utilize that chat function to pipe in as we go. And I think that's all. So Alex, I will kick it off to you to carry on.
Awesome. But obviously, you're only going to flag the easy questions, right, Jack? Nothing that's going to make me look, nothing that's going to make me look too bad, right?
Of course not.
Cool. Amazing. Well, let's get into it. So the value of advocacy, I think it's a wide-ranging topic. There's a whole bunch of things that we could discuss. So I really wanted to boil it down into three areas today and make the best use of the next sort of 30 minutes or so. If I kind of take us through what we're going to be covering, essentially we're looking at the challenges that brands face today, and there is a few of them. I'm going to try and move through that part relatively quickly because I don't think that people are here to just listen to us regurgitate what's happening in the news and things like that. But actually, we're going to be using it as a foundation for what we are then able to kind of see in the market about how acquiring customers is therefore changing. And then most importantly, how scaling brand advocacy can help to kind of tackle some of those customer acquisition costs as well. So that's the plan for this session. Like Jack said, please do interject as and when. Don't feel like questions need to be parked until the very end. I'm more than happy to work our way through them as we go. So despite what our bank accounts might be looking like, we're actually spending a lot less as consumers versus this time last year. So the British Retail Consortium, they release monthly figures in terms of the amount of spend that's taking place in the market. Last month versus the previous year, we were actually down 1.1%. And if you compared April to the previous year as well, we were down 0.3%. So it's not just that we're spending less this year as consumers, we're actually accelerating that downward trend, which is something that we obviously are all conscious of and need to keep an eye of. it might be small numbers, you know, a percent here, 0.3 there, but when you pile that onto everything else that brands are having to work with these days, obviously it all adds up. So in terms of some of the challenges that people are facing, you know, I think energy bills are something that everyone, not just people in their homes, but businesses too, are kind of feeling the pinch on at the moment. So sharing a little, a kind of graph to look at how that's going to be projected, it's almost doubling where we were at points last year. So that's something that businesses need to absorb as a cost on top of everything else. In terms of other factors that are also affecting the way that businesses are running at the moment, there's things like fuel, which is also, you know, making people take a bit of a hit. The boss of a haulage company actually came out yesterday and said that on average, it's costing more than 20K in addition to what they were normally paying to fuel a truck. Now, a truck, you might think, well, I don't drive one, it's not really particularly relevant to me. But actually, when you imagine the amount of product, particularly consumer products that come through freight, whether that be via ships and, you know, via lorries across our motorways and highways, 20K per lorry in addition is just yet another cost that somebody's going to be passing on. And that's a trend that's really also spiked in the last few months recently. Finally, one of the major cost changes that we're seeing at the moment is actually labor costs. So that the fact that people's pay is increasing is inherently a positive thing. Like, we all want that. That sounds like great news, right? But obviously in isolation, it actually doesn't really amount to a lot for the consumer. So when you look at actually people's pockets and what they kind of end up taking home at the end of the day, in the first 3 months of this year, pay's increased roughly 4.2%. That's a positive thing. But then when you look at the cost of inflation that people are feeling, and that's not just things like energy and fuel that we talked about, but, you know, food prices are estimated to increase by about 15% of this year due to a number of factors, not just the war that we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment. The actual end result is that people's costs of living are accelerating faster than their wages are rising. So businesses are having to pay more for energy, they're having to pay more for fuel, they're having to pay more for labor, and then the consumer isn't even benefiting from that increase in pay for labor because inflation's outpacing it. So they end up actually having less money to spend as a result. And what that means is that brands are kind of only faced with one option: increasing costs here, increasing costs there. It means that ultimately brands end up needing to hike their prices or feel like they need to hike their prices as a result. And what does that do to somebody who's taking home less money than they were previously? Well, it means as a result, they're going to be spending even less. Prices are going up. Consumers are more savvy, more wary about where they're deciding to spend their money. You know, there's retail bosses that have come out and said that actually all that impulse buying, that sort of treat yourself kind of nature is really taking a hit at the moment, and people are being really, really considered about the investments that they're making. So, I mean, overall, confidence is pretty low for the consumer. And I think for somebody who's responsible for having to build a brand, this might all kind of seem pretty depressing, right? This is a gift that often circulates the company Slack channel, but it really feels like you're up against it, that there's a million things coming at you. Now, ultimately, it might feel like the world's on fire, but we don't need any more pessimism. It's not going to solve everything. What we really need is to find some solutions. And given that I'm no expert on the economy, as any of the teachers who taught me at school would also back me up on, what we do know how to do is affect one cost that's hitting brands that I think we actually can have a real impact on. and that is the customer acquisition costs. So before I go into that, and before I go into ways to kind of tackle that customer acquisition increase, we really need to understand the way that buyers have kind of shifted in terms of their mentality and how they're purchasing at the moment. So, the modern consumer is not hardwired in the same way that consumers of previous years used to be. Modern consumers require modern solutions. And there's been a lot of change that's happened that has kind of accelerated that. So whilst this session isn't a detailed explanation into like privacy laws and things like that, what I thought would be valuable would be to understand what's brought us to this point in order to then help us to really find ways to mitigate some of the challenges that we've been experiencing so far. So hopefully that makes sense. I very intentionally wanted to breeze through those first few slides because, to be honest, I didn't enjoy making them. People don't enjoy listening to them, but it is a reality that we all have, and one that, with a little bit of understanding towards, we can try and overcome.
Alex, just before we carry on, for our international listeners who aren't from the UK, will you confirm? I'm assuming those are UK stats. Of course, we're experiencing this across the world right now, but the stats specifically that you've shared today are UK.
So the ones that we've pulled, this wasn't any kind of reaction to the patriotism we've had over the last week celebrating the Queen's Jubilee, but those were UK stats. Absolutely happy to share some of the more US or even global trends that really show how we're not the only country that's experiencing this. Certainly fuel shortages, energy prices, that is something that is happening across the globe. I would actually say that inflation, the way that that's the pinch that people are feeling, that's going to be having an even more direct impact on the slightly less developed countries. So as a barometer, the rate of inflation in the US and the UK is different, but kind of marginal. But totally hear that, and more than happy to share a few links afterwards that are more specific to certain demographics.
Awesome, thanks.
Of course. So in terms of those modern solutions, they've kind of been accelerated because of a change that happened last year. So towards the beginning of last year, there was a pretty momentous shift rather in the way that brands were able to target their prospective audience, the way that they'll be able to acquire new customers. So iOS 14, I think myself included, just kind of parked it as, Apple made some changes. It's kind of made things more difficult. It's kind of made what I do more inefficient. So I need to spend more to overcompensate for it. But actually, if we take a little bit of time just unpicking why some of those changes happened, we actually can find better ways to combat the effect that they've had on us trying to engage with our audience and us trying to tell our story as a brand. So, I'm not sure if there's anyone in the chat, for example, right now, or even Jack yourself, if you knew, or rather, let me phrase this differently. Would you be comfortable with me knowing exactly what apps you visit on your phone, when you visit them, what you're searching for, what you're purchasing, all of that kind of thing? Would you be comfortable with me knowing that?
Absolutely not. I know I'm getting tracked all the time, but I don't want to agree that openly to getting tracked.
And given you and I work pretty closely, right? So you wouldn't even trust me with that information, which I'm semi-offended by, but I actually do I do understand the logic behind it. What is it about that makes you uncomfortable then?
Feels quite invasive. I don't necessarily need Apple when they ask me to track, or you when they ask me to track what I'm up to all the time. It feels invasive of my privacy.
That's fair. And I'd feel the same way. Everybody has this right to privacy, and Apple kind of thought similar. or at least that's certainly how they positioned it to the rest of the market. You know, they said that we believe that the end user should be able to decide how their information is used and to give them the power to make that choice. What it does for Apple's own advertising platforms and things like that is another thing, but let's not get into that right now. More importantly, they made a change, and that was rolled out with iOS 14.5. What that change does is essentially users needed to opt in or give permission for an app to be able to track their activity outside the platform. And that's called ATT, or App Tracking Transparency. So you'd have probably seen a bunch of pop-ups like this, particularly when you go into a new app and you download it for the first time and it says, ask the app not to track or to allow them to track. Now, one of the biggest responses that you get from people when it comes to privacy of any kind, to be honest, this isn't even an iOS thing, is, I mean, who cares? Like, okay, somebody knows that I bought something from a store. I think it's something like 60 odd % of adults in the US just kind of accept that they're going to browse the internet and that at some point their data is going to be tracked, and maybe it's a bit of a necessary evil in that case. Well, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that's absolutely fine. But I think that what people often forget is that it's the level of tracking that you're allowing and the level of that invasion of privacy that people find a little bit uncomfortable. So in essence, as you're browsing from one app to another on your phone has an ID, an identifier for advertisers. This identifier for advertisers isn't just saying that you bought that beautiful new velour Juicy Couture tracksuit or anything like that. It's actually capturing a hell of a lot more. It's capturing things like your age, your location. Again, these are probably things that you're thinking, it's by the by. It's capturing your health stats. You know, there have been some quite scary and intimidating stories about how particular demographics of people have been targeted because, you know, advertisers are able to know that they're pregnant, that they're diabetic, that they're in the process of going through cancer treatments. You know, the amount of data that these advertisers are able to leverage in order to retarget people is pretty alarming. And then, of course, you've got the more expected things like your spending habits and your browsing history. So when that's shared across other apps, and especially your social media, people really, really start to get uncomfortable. And that's where ATT, App Tracking Transparency, really has kind of made a difference. The onus is now on the person to say, you know what? I actually don't appreciate my health stats being shared publicly across a whole range of channels to a whole range of people who have no business knowing what my health condition is. So what's this got to do with brands, right? I think obviously this is more to do with a sort of movement towards claiming back privacy and all of that sort of thing. But the impact that it has on brands is significant. You know, we all use data in our personal lives and our professional lives to make decisions. And obviously, so is somebody who's going to be trying to build a brand. This is especially true when it comes to advertising. So if you target someone's behavior online, or if you target them with ads based on their behavior, then if that data is not being captured, then it means that it's going to be less personalized, it's going to be less relevant, less specific. And if it's less personalized and less specific, the ad campaign, the ad itself, is going to be less effective. So the fact that this change has happened has meant that it's going to have an impact on brands and their ability to advertise effectively. How big? Well, given it was released in October 2021, a report by AppsFlyer found that roughly 62% of iPhone users, those who had the new update, which I think was something like, the best part of 80% of devices, they were opting out already. 2/3 gone. No longer have you got this data, or no longer have you got the most recent version of this data for 2/3 of your demographic. What that does mean is that the remaining 38%, the rest of the people who are like, yeah, who cares, happy to opt in, their data is even more expensive now to get hold of. And platforms are passing on that cost to the people who have to advertise through it, like Facebook and Instagram. We'll kind of go into them. It does vary by industry. This is one of those statistics that's a generalization. So there's some industries where actually more people opt in, or more people are finding creative ways to opt in, which we'll discuss as well. But the message here really is that a change has happened, and it's a significant change. So what does it mean for these advertising platforms that brands are using? Well, what Facebook's trying to do is they're trying to reduce the need for this tracking by making it much easier to buy in the app. But in order to buy in the app, you need to make sure you've got loads of people using the app. And if anyone can cast their mind back to earlier this year in Feb, Facebook had their biggest one-day loss, their single biggest one-day loss of their share price, which dropped by about 25%. 25% already sounds like a big deal. It's a bigger deal when that 25% accounts for $220 billion. In one day, they lost $220 billion off of their share value. Now, to put that into context, I remember doing a bit of digging around this when I was researching. That's roughly equivalent, just in the loss, not the value of the company. That loss is the equivalent to the GDP of the 54th country, I think it is, in the world. That's a higher GDP than some pretty affluent Middle Eastern states like Qatar and Kuwait, European countries like Bulgaria, Croatia, and a whole bunch of other pretty established communities. This loss alone was equivalent to their GDP, which is kind of insane when you put it into that perspective. What's the point in putting it into that perspective? Well, it just goes to show how influential the number of people who use a platform is. So what caused this loss in one day? They released their reports to say that for the first time ever, they lost daily active users. People are turning away from platforms like Facebook because they're growing more and more disillusioned with it, the way that it's abused privacy laws, the way that it's profited off the spread of misinformation in the past. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. So what it means for these platforms, these changes, is they are just wishing money away. So that's one thing. Obviously, we're more concerned about brands. And I thought that this quote summed it up pretty nicely. So I won't read out the whole thing to you because you can see it there on the screen. But essentially, we need to find more trustworthy ways to engage with our consumers that therefore make it more cost effective and more efficient. And now this is when we get into the real kind of meat of the issue here and the value of brand advocacy. Because if you notice, we haven't mentioned brand advocacy once so far, rather than at the very beginning when we introed this. It's all been about looking at the situation we're in, really understanding why, and then seeing what are the options that we have to change this. What's that light at the end of the tunnel? Well, if the reaction to this is to diversify your ad spend and find better ways to target your audience, if it's looking at the data you have to create lookalike audiences and things like that, that's one thing. Great. I think you're sort of trying to scrape the barrel in terms of the way that consumer behavior online is trending. But actually, this last one is really the most important one. Rather than leveraging a third-party platform, rather than going to a Facebook and saying, you're going to be the solution to me engaging with my audience, it's really about creating this direct channel, this two-way communication channel with your community, especially through a format that they trust. And this is where brand advocacy really kind of comes into its own. Because if people aren't trusting what they're seeing on Facebook, then they don't trust the brand that's advertising on Facebook. Now, when it comes to customer acquisition costs, I've really included this in here just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. So forgive me if this is 20 seconds of something that people are already pretty well versed in. But essentially, you kind of calculate customer acquisition costs by taking the cost of your sales and the cost of your marketing, you add them together, and then you divide it by the number of new customers that you've acquired. So your customer acquisition cost is essentially how much you're spending in order to get one more customer. So very rudimentary. It's £1,000 here. It's £5,000 there, or dollars in this example. And that particular campaign gets you 300 new customers. That's $20. But enough of the maths lesson. That's a very kind of quick and dirty way of how to calculate this. More importantly, it's what do we do to affect it? So when a brand is having to calculate their customer acquisition costs, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's kind of factored in here, right? It's not just how much they spend on Facebook. We know that that's becoming increasingly ineffective and something that people are less able to depend on. But it's also the cost of their staff. And we just spoke about how labor costs are increasing. It's also using, additional talent to promote the business. So it could be getting freelancers to help on campaigns, for example. It's then also publishing their campaigns too, and the technical costs of platforms that are needed to run them. So you're paying for your CRM, you're paying for your different kind of tools that you're using for different areas and different activities that you're trying to run. And then finally, you've also got your production costs as well, like hiring equipment to make sure you're shooting on a live set, making sure that you're capturing this amazing content, which you can then pump into the top, into your ads as well. So brands are having to deal with a whole host of stuff and more. And it is just going up and up and up and up. Now, I said that we kind of left the doom and gloom behind, but we need to appreciate that obviously we've got these additional kind of concerns that we need to factor in, as well as an increasingly busy market. So anyone who's been on holiday, who's visited a souk, who's been to a market, everyone's vying to grab your attention. Everyone's trying to show you the shiny new thing. Everyone's trying to really make you give all of your attention to them over and above the person next to them. And COVID has accelerated that for e-commerce brands in a way that we never thought was never going to be possible, or certainly not at the speed that it was. So it's chaos. Everyone's fighting for your attention, and it's costing them more to do that. So how has that had an impact then? Well, last year, Shopify found that even just between Q2 and Q3 alone, the cost of paid search ads were 15% higher, and they were driving less return. So people were paying more for paid search ads, and they were getting less off the back of it. In addition to that, the cost per mil, the amount of money that brands had to spend to just get in front of 1,000 people, that tripled in the last 2 years. So this is just another cost that people have to account for at the same time. So it's not just privacy, but the impact of a lot of things that are happening around us, like COVID, as well as the increasing number of brands that are all fighting to get people's attention. Not just new brands. It's the old, the older brands as well, the more established brands that are saying, God, we really need to get online. We need to make sure that we've got a presence there, because how many household names are we seeing that are kind of crashing and burning that were too big to fail? So what we essentially are trying to work out is, if these channels don't work, what channels do, particularly for a consumer that's lost trust and lost faith recently in what they're being projected in the ads that they're being served. If you look at some of the traditional channels that consumers are having their messages delivered to them, there are degrees of trust in those different channels. And the ones at the top end are all connected to somebody sharing a referral, somebody sharing a recommendation, someone giving a review, so, word of mouth. All of these things are activities that come from advocates. So when we look at the value of brand advocacy, and we look at the situation that we find ourselves in today as well, with all of this shitstorm that's going on around us, where are the pockets of opportunity for brands to grow cost effectively? Advocacy isn't going to help with your fuel prices. Advocacy is not going to help, unfortunately, with your energy bills. I'd love that, but it won't. Where it can help, and where we'll get into at the tail end of this, is actually in your customer acquisition costs. So even if we're not focusing on trust, like what's the bottom line here? What's the real value of advocacy? We had our laundry list of costs. We had all of the things that we needed to factor in when a brand is working out its CAC. How advocacy brings that down actually applies in different ways to them. So advocates are an amazing pool of people to get information back from. Surveys, conversations. Jack, I've heard you talk about this before as well, in terms of bringing up people who you see engage with your communications, whether that's emails, ringing up people and speaking to them who are engaging with you on social media, for example. There's a whole host of ways in which you can engage with your customers and find that insight, rather than being dependent on the insights, the inaccurate insights that some advertiser is trying to sell to you. Really look at the valuable personal info that someone's willing to share. What's going to get someone to give you their birthday so you can calculate their age? What's going to get someone to give you their location so that you can calculate, where your product's really picking up a lot of traction? How are you going to get insights through surveys and polls? It could even be the creative of your ads. You can share product feedback and say, vote for your favorite one. Which one resonates best with you, audience, before pumping loads of money and putting it onto a channel. So I've just included a screenshot, for example, of how Juul does it. But this honestly is not a Juul plug. Like, it's probably not the right company line for me to say, but you don't need Juul for this. You can pick up the phone, you can speak to someone. That's all it takes to start gathering this information. I think obviously where that does change is if you want to do that to not 5 people or 10 people, but you want to do it to 1,000, 2,000 people, you've got to find a way to do it at scale. Otherwise, you're going to be on the phone a lot. This is another screenshot, but actually, to be perfectly honest with you, because I didn't want to try and find any more icons or things like that, and it kind of captures it quite nicely. You can use your existing community as well as a place to drive awareness and revenue. People just seem to default to performance marketing to drive awareness because it's easy. That's the beauty of Facebook. It is a piece of cake to buy an ad on Facebook. And for a long time now, it's really difficult to drive that awareness or drive that sales revenue through your advocates. Word of mouth was that kind of like mysterious dark art. But if you're able to set up referral schemes, affiliate codes, using your biggest advocates as a channel for growth, makes this process so much easier, and you're not having to fork out a bunch of money for ineffective ads. This is just gifting someone. This is just putting the product in their hands and saying, look, we know you love the product. You're already a customer of ours. You're already in our community. Put it on, wear it, try it out, use it. What was your experience like? Share it with that group of people who know you well. And that is far more trustworthy, as we saw in that graph a couple of slides ago, than having to push that agenda or push that narrative through a paid search or a paid social ad. Now, how you manage that at scale, that has an effect on your employee costs as well. Because like I said, you're not going to be calling everyone every day. You're not going to be able to be juggling a whole bunch of spreadsheets trying to manually pull all of these different advocates together. So there are tools out there to help you. We actually have an article, I believe, that depending on what you're looking for, we've got some recommendations. And spoiler alert, they're not all dual. Like, we are very, very clear and very honest and transparent with the brands that we work with, where we believe we can add value and where we think they can get value better elsewhere. Another tool that serves their objectives. So happy to share that as well, Jack, afterwards, in terms of that follow-up for people to base what kind of tool they can use to minimize their headcount, not reduce it, just keep it where it is, but still be able to scale using a platform like Joule or another. And then these creative and production costs also dramatically reduce as well, because you're not having to go out there and hire models or go on expeditions to take photos and hiring sets and the equipment that comes all with that. All this user-generated content that's coming out of the people that love you the most already, that are using this, that user-generated content is amazing collateral that saves you a bunch of time and a bunch of money on production costs. So why invest all of that effort into building assets when there are people who would happily do it for you already? And then last but not least, one of the costs that we hadn't touched on yet, that really kind of demonstrates the value of brand advocacy, is the technical costs as well. So people feel like they need to juggle a survey and feedback tool versus a referral tool versus an affiliates tool versus a UGC tool versus this and that. There's this expectation that advocacy is really, really expensive, that actually, because it's so much more difficult to track and difficult to measure, that you need to overcompensate versus other technical products that you might have used before. There are options out there. Joule is one of them, but there are options out there that, depending on your need, can consolidate all of these things into one platform. So it actually is not just better in terms of the cost, but actually it means that all of your data is in one place now. So measuring the impact and being able to make smarter decisions is actually so much easier than it might have been before. So when we talk about the value of brand advocacy, it's not just to do with top of funnel. It's not just to do with awareness and revenue, which is, pretty important. There's a whole host of other ways that brand advocacy actually allows an individual, a brand builder, who's trying to scale in an authentic way in an increasingly difficult market, just by using a piece of technology that's able to consolidate all of those different actions that they would typically be spending a lot more money and a lot more time doing, all into one place. So hopefully that was a slightly more positive end than how we got started. But just as a bit of a quick recap, kind of talking about the state of play today and just, painting a bit more color into why it is that we're in the situation we're in. How recent changes have affected the way we acquire customers, and then obviously how you can then deploy brand advocates, ambassadors, customers, whoever they might be, to really help tackle the part of the business that we know well, that we speak to brands with about every day. But like I said, when it comes to fuel or when it comes to energy, that might not be something that brand advocacy solves. But customer acquisition is obviously something that's on a lot of people's minds. And hopefully I've shared a few of the different ways in which it helps to overcome that challenge. So that's everything from me, Jack.
Amazing, Alex. Thank you so much. We do have a couple minutes right now If anybody wants to ask any more questions in the chat, you can either send it to everybody or just to us. I do have one that has come through, Alex, that I will ask you.
Of
And
course.
it is, how do I make a business case for this? Is the ROI super clear? The board and VCs always love to know where every dollar is spent. Is this possible?
Yes. Is it easy? Up until recently, no. So the first thing that you often hear in brand advocacy, or when you're comparing brand advocacy to other channels, or as a solution for growth compared to others, is, well, what's my return on investment? And we have spent decades making it really, really compelling and really easy to say, if I spend $1 on Google Ads, I'm going to get this amount in return. If I spend $1 on Facebook ads, I'm going to get this amount in return. Now, there's a few ways you can calculate ROI. I know that Ollie, who's talking about the economics of advocacy next week, is going to do a bit more of a deeper dive into this. But because I don't want to leave the question going unanswered, it is quite similar actually to how you'd calculate a normal campaign. And I say a normal campaign, probably a traditional campaign is the better way of saying it. You would post an ad, you would calculate how many people you think it would get in front of. You would calculate how many people would engage with that ad, either by clicking on it or whatever it might be, and then how many purchases are made off the back of that. There is now technology which allows you to do that, but with authentic advocates. So it doesn't have to be calculating the cost of a campaign. What you're actually doing now instead is calculating the cost of an advocate. So of course, you don't traditionally say, how am I going to calculate the cost of an advocate, right? It also kind of, it makes it feel less wholesome in terms of brand building. But when you're stood there in front of the board, when you're talking about ROI, these are serious decisions which you want to put money behind and invest in. And if it's a choice between this channel or another, and your business is at stake, of course, you're going to start to calculate the cost of an advocate. And so what we at least help brands do is we will say, based on your margins, based on the kind of, say, the gifting or the rewards that you want to offer, based on the commission that you're going to share, based on the referrals that you're willing to put into the form of codes, we calculate that for every one advocate who joins your program that's worth this much to the business, you will attract 3 advocates in return, based on some of the best practices that we have. So is it easy to do? Previously, no. But today we have far more information at our disposal where we can create a really compelling case for senior management and the board when it comes to the ROI of advocacy. But hopefully I haven't stolen too much of Ollie's thunder for next week.
No, that's perfect. Okay, awesome. That's good to know. We are coming near the end. So if anybody has any more questions, please send them. I will pop my email in the chat so you can send them directly to me. If anybody wants to chat anything regarding the value of advocacy or building communities from scratch or from the beginning through, also let us know. We're always here to support. One of the things that I want to end with, which is what Alex said in the beginning or near in the intro to the value, is go back to basics on this. And often I'm in these conversations where brands ask, they're experts at performance marketing, not experts at community building, which is totally fine. And community starts with the basics, and it seems too simple. And if it's too simple, it's perfect. We're actually going back to, calling people up, asking their opinion, asking for their feedback, putting on focus groups to really get them into this realm of co-creating and emotionally connected to any brand. So Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Cool.
I am going to pop in the link for the economics of advocacy into the chat to everybody. So we will see you next week with Ollie. And if you did want the recording from the other session that you don't have, please send me a note. That is my email, and we will get that to you right away.
Thanks so much, Jack. And really appreciate the questions.
Amazing. Thanks for joining, everybody, and we'll chat soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.